Okay, so warm welcome to HKU Research Hub of Population Studies Seminar Series. And my name is Satoshi Araki from the Department of Sociology at the University of Hong Kong. And so because of the typhoon, and unfortunately we had to switch to this Zoom mode from the in-person seminar. But we are very much fortunate to have a very much distinguished speaker, Professor Arthur Sakamoto. And as many of you know, Professor Sakamoto is a very much esteemed sociologist and currently the department chair and professor of sociology at Hong Kong Baptist University. And prior to moving to Hong Kong, Professor Sakamoto taught at University of Texas Austin and also Texas A&M University for over 30 years, if I understand it correctly. And he has also published numerous papers in top journals such as American Sociological Review, Annual Review of Sociology, Demography, and so on and so forth. And also his research also covers very much broad topics, including stratification and inequality, race and ethnicity, demography, economic sociology, and also East Asian studies. And today, he is very much kindly going to give a talk entitled The Declining Significance of Education for Promoting Equality, so which sounds very much exciting. And the presentation is planned for around 40 minutes and followed by Q&A for the rest of the session, so which means for around 15 minutes. And for the participant audience, if you have any questions, please feel free to use the chat box or the raise hand at the bottom, so summed up icon. So after the presentation, and I will invite you to ask questions after the Professor Sakamoto's presentation. So Arthur, if you are ready, over to you.
Okay, yes, thank you so much. And I'm going to share my screen here. First of all, it's a pleasure to be here, and Satoshi gave me an overly generous introduction, but I appreciate it. I have a fair number of slides here. I'm going to go a little bit quickly, but if you Google my name and declining significance of education, you can download the slides if you're interested. But we have so much research on education. We have departments of education. We have journals of education. We have so much work going on that sometimes we need to do a review. And this paper is more of that genre, that a lot of work has been going on, and I'm interested to sort of summarize the macro level relationship. So there's a very big difference between the micro or individual level and the aggregate or societal level, the micro-macro connection. And my focus is really on societies, on the macro level connection between aggregate economic trends, socioeconomic inequality, and the expansion of the educational system in terms of more people completing tertiary education. And the basic conclusion that I reach is that for societies that are already developed, for developed nations, as we move towards more people graduating a college or a tertiary educational degree, there's declining effects on how that increases economic productivity. It doesn't reduce income inequality that much, and intergenerational mobility, it isn't really promoted. And, that's counterintuitive, but let me emphasize, this is a macro level relationship. It's for post-industrial societies. And to the extent that this is accurate, I think we have to be cautious about spending too much money on tertiary educational expansion, because the welfare state expenditures are quite costly, and they're more effective in promoting equality. So it is still true, especially with increasing technology, that you get general skills from your education, but a lot of the workplace skills really are learned on the job. And so you don't really learn that in the school per se. If we're going to spend a lot of money on education, we have to worry about these issues about how much productivity are we getting from these expenditures. My implicit kind of focus here is on the American audience. I think in Asia and Europe, the trend has been a little bit different, but basically you can see here from the left-hand side that the US, when you add in local and state plus federal expenditures, I mean, we actually spend a lot more on education than we spend on military defense. And the US spends more on its military than most of the world. 1/3 of all the military dollars spent in the world are spent in this US defense, over $1 trillion in 2022. So education is very costly. We see this on the right-hand side here in this graph. There's various graphs, but they're all pointing to this rise in the cost of tuition at American universities, far exceeding the general inflation rate. So, I mean, it's a non-trivial issue. How much money are we spending? So the client-centered education for promoting equality, Satoshi and I were at this talk by James Heckman, one of the great social scientists of all time. And he has a very different title and a somewhat different perspective. So, I want to sort of clarify that my position here is really about tertiary education. For Heckman, he was focusing on primaries, like preschool, 3 and 4-year-olds. And, that's very different from college students. So I'm not disputing his talk specifically, but my focus again is on the aggregate level and on the macro or across society. So this is not an individual level analysis. When we talk about causal effects, we often invoke the Stutva assumption, a stable unit treatment value assumption. If I brush my teeth, that improves my dental health. But that doesn't depend on whether other people brush your teeth or do they brush your teeth often or not. In a causal analysis at the individual level, we have plenty of studies and they control for many variables, and that's fine. What is the net effect of education? But education in the labor market, I mean, there's competition. There's zero-sum competition. And so your education in a post-industrial society is increasingly a screening or credentialist effect, because still we're trying to hire talented people with good skills, but most of your job skills are learned through employment, not through taking classes. And so in developed societies, there's a declining impact on these aggregate economic outcomes. This idea originally dates back to the 1970s and early 1980s. For example, Randall Collins and other studies noted that there's declining returns to increasing educational expansion at the aggregate level. Now, at the individual level, it's still economically rational. The question here is, at the aggregate level, is it rational for society to be spending this much money? As we saw in the previous slides, expenditures on education exceed military expenditures. As we expand education, it's largely outside STEM fields, and STEM degrees are a little more applied in the labor market. So again, my focus is the aggregate level, and this strategy of college for all is popular in the US, but I mean, the reality is the US is an outlier here in spending so much money on education. So let me just go to the next slide here. Maybe a little problem here going to the next slide. Okay, there we are. So, this slide is just to point out that there is not infinite demand for college-educated labor. In fact, in the US today, the majority of sociologists are not tenure track. The most professors or teaching staff in American universities are lecturers, are part-time workers. And so, even in a, high-skilled job such as teaching, technology has a way of reducing costs. And so the US produces 500 plus PhDs in sociology every year, but go read, the ASA, American Sociological Association report. I mean, there's 50 or 70 jobs at most, and they're producing many more, maybe, 8 times, 10 times more per year. And so they end up doing other jobs. But I'm just saying, you produce more and more college-educated people. That doesn't mean the jobs are there. So at the early stages of productivity for industrialization, tertiary expansion is important. And, if you look at a place, say, like Malaysia, Elon Musk is setting up a Tesla plant there because Malaysian government is giving him some incentives. But Malaysia is a place where, it's simply true that the Chinese and the Indian Malay are some of the best engineers. But the affirmative action laws prioritize Malay and other indigenous Malaysian groups. And Tesla, Elon Musk, the CEO, said, look, I can't set up shop there if I don't have enough talent. And so the Malaysian government is specifically waiving affirmative action laws for Tesla to set up shop there. And so in the early stage of industrialization, there's an undersupply of college-educated labor. And it also promotes more meritocratic labor market. In that context, more educational expansion will be good for economic productivity. But when you get to 1/3 of your labor force is college educated or more, then you see these declining effects. It's almost become taboo in American sociology to study productivity, but it's relevant for the issue here. And by the way, Karl Marx spent a lot of time talking about the means of production and the mode of production. So I don't think we should not be studying productivity, but the most basic model is, capital and labor, more inputs, you get more output, productivity in terms of the total quantity produced per input. And there's an intercept reflecting technology and social organization, social relations of production, as Marx called it. In the human capital school, you add in this coefficient, how educated is labor? I mean, it's not all labor is equally productive. So the human capital model generally fits better than the basic model, but if you think of it slightly more sociologically and allow for occupations, part of education is it identifies higher skilled workers that can be employed in professional and managerial occupations, which have a bigger direct effect on productivity given their skill. So for developing nations, expanding education has this direct effect. Workers are more productive, but especially you've allocated the most productive workers to the occupations where it matters the most. So that's sort of the technical functional model that Collins developed. And I think for the post-industrial society, what we see is, as I've been arguing, is that at the aggregate level, these coefficients start having negative declining interaction, quadratic term. So this second derivative just means that if you set this equation up as a regression, the quadratic term has a negative coefficient. So it's going up, but it's declining. The rate at which it's going up is declining. And so that's what I mean by the declining significance. If we wanted to take schooling and just aggregate into different types of skill, IQ, social skills, other academic skills are embodied in years of schooling or human capital. But especially in the case of IQ, you can see that, you know, it is not really augmented very much by tertiary education. That means you're just getting students who are less selective. And so that's part of the declining significance. You're educating people that are marginal in compared to the top performers in augmenting their productivity by college. So in a post-industrial society, we see these declining effects. This paper is not well known, but just to show how this can be operationalized, I looked at industrial level data for manufacturing industries because value added in terms of the revenues generated from the products produced net of energy and material costs. We have a clear measure of productivity here. The capital, the labor, mean years of schooling. And then I also included an indicator of relative educational attainment. And so these are for industries in the US between 1970 and 1996. There's other control variables for age, race, gender, and regional status. But theoretically, the variables of interest is the ratio level, how much human capital, as the human capital theory traditional model emphasizes. But the credentialist effect is the relative educational score, which is a percentile. So it's the average percentile of the employees in an industry. So the percentile corresponds to the Z-score associated with years of schooling in that industry, broken down by 5-year cohort. I mean, this would be perfectly collinear. R and S would be correlated and would not be able to estimate the equation were it not broken down by 5-year cohort, because we employ people based on their schooling, and as they get more and more job experience, their prior schooling is less of a credential, and your immediate productivity is your more important credential. But if we go here and look at the results on productivity, you can see that, you know, if you have this production function, human capital is significant, quite significant, but so is relative educational attainment. And if you include both of them, for the US, for these industries between 79 and 1996, it's really the relative effect that you're hiring better workers rather than the human capital that you're hiring. So other data, I mean, if you just study productivity data, US and Europe, you know, they're expanding their education, but, you know, the level of productivity hasn't been correspondingly. I mean, there is productivity growth, but it's, you know, it's less than the educational growth. Now, there's a famous book by Golden and Katz that, you know, emphasize to the contrary that education was very important, but they don't have any direct measure of productivity. They're just assuming all of the benefit of income for college grads relative to high school grads is directly due to productivity. And economists are fond of making that wage simply affects productivity. But the reality is, I think from a sociological point of view, the workers who are less skilled, the technology can monitor them and create a gig economy and technology that drives down their wages. It's harder to do that for high skilled workers. I mean, it's still going on there too, but what I'm saying, there's technological and organizational factors that are affecting the college, high school wage gap. It isn't just productivity. So if you look at within educational groups in the US, that's where most of the wage inequality has grown. And ironically, Golden and Katz themselves found this later on. I actually tried to measure directly college educated labor. They were a little more productive in these industries, but their remuneration, their wages were higher than their marginal revenue product. So, I mean, there is some credentialism going on, is what I'm saying here. So China may be next. As we see, there's a lot of expansion in recent years in the Chinese tertiary sector. Proportion going on to college is quite high, and it probably is true in the early decades of Chinese economic growth. They were very important, but we see studies now that with all this expansion, tertiary education, the productivity is starting to taper off. This macroeconomist actually, I mean, I'm not sure I believe it, but he actually says if you took the money out of education that is spent and put it directly into factories or industrial productivity, that would have increased productivity more than putting it into the educational system. That there was actually negative effects by 2015 in terms of educational expansion. I'm not sure I go that far. He's actually negative, but that's building in the opportunity cost. The money you're spending, it could be spent elsewhere. And so, that's a very macroeconomic analysis. If you look at studies of recent college graduates, my colleague here, Jing Zhang, and her colleague, looked at rising unemployment, particularly in non-coastal areas where mobility may be reduced to the hukou. And, you have more and more college graduates, but you're having trouble finding jobs. And the government is thinking about spending more on sort of training programs that may be more effective. So what this shows is that, post-secondary educational schooling is having declining significance for economic productivity, which sort of compromises a simple human capital view. In the US, if you look at academic skills, this study that came out, some of these large state massive universities, there's a lot of students who aren't very focused, and they take easy classes. There's tremendous grade inflation. Obviously, there's a lot of social activity, and those may be good things, but he didn't actually find that much more improvement in academic skills, which is kind of depressing. That's in the US, but generally, if economic and perhaps even academic skills or productivity and skills are not increasing now, it's not surprising that this has not reduced income inequality. So as more and more Americans get a college degree, income inequality keeps going up. So people talk about the good old days when income was more equal. Well, there were fewer people graduating from college. And in fact, the oldest of the cohort, people like, my parents' generation, they're all retired. They didn't go to college, but so that's the labor force is actually much more educated than the recent cohorts indicate due to educational expansion. And so income inequality is increasing in the US quite rapidly, but you would not expect that if you thought there was a one-to-one relationship with tertiary educational expansion. So from a cross-national perspective, the U.S., has a fair amount of, college graduation, but it's more unequal in terms of income compared to other OECD countries. In terms of intergenerational mobility, basically you get the same story. Now, mobility is kind of complicated to study. So, I mean, there's more kinds of methodological issues there. But if you look just absolute income, that's driven by economic growth. And economic growth was large, up until about the 1975 or so. And so you can see that because do you get absolutely more income than your parents? Are you living better than your parents? And that's starting to, that has really tapered out in the US. And I think it may be quite slowing down for young people in China. You hear people talking about Tamping and the younger people kind of giving up, but that's probably because the opportunities are slowing down relative to the previous decades of high economic growth. Relative income means your rank in the distribution, that has not been increasing. Some people argue it's declining, but it's certainly not increasing. The returns to college are increasing in the US, but that's because the high school and the high school dropouts, their wages are terrible. And so relative to them, yeah, you're doing great. But in terms of previous cohorts, you're not doing better than they were. The US is not particularly high in terms of the IGE, the intergenerational earnings elasticity. Some people say it's 0.5, some people want to say a little higher, but that's not low, even though we spend a lot of money on education. Other studies reach this conclusion. Xiang Zhou in this American Sociological Review article was very detailed kind of causal analysis and concludes that more college expansion doesn't increase intergenerational mobility. In the UK, in Scandinavia, slightly different methods, but reaching similar conclusion. If you look at African Americans, their educational attainment has tremendously increased relative to their parents and grandparents, but the income mobility has not increased, despite the educational mobility. Raj Chetty, using a lot of data, the mobility has not increased. That's pretty, I think, an established finding here. The Xinjiang article, again, if you just subjectively ask people, what are your subjective impression? And for these Chinese regions, the younger cohort can see, or at least they feel, and will say that upward social mobility, the chances are narrower than before, and they strongly agree 78% in Hong Kong, and similarly in Taiwan and Guangzhou. So, the young people can see that. Older study here, educational attainment in Europe and Australia and Japan, US, it hasn't increased that much mobility. The Hiroshi Ishida article, 5 or actually 6 decades of Japanese data. The previous studies are occupation. The previous studies are income. These are occupational studies, and they reach pretty much similar conclusions. So, in the US, that is kind of my main audience for this talk, is that, American sociology is so dominant on the rest of the world, but Americans have a very individualistic view of how stratification occurs. And the Sutpha assumption may be fine for health studies, but for education, there's a lot of these relative competition. There's a lot of almost zero-sum competition. It's a collective enterprise, and what may be rational for the individual is not necessarily rational for society as all. If we're spending as we speak, $1.7 trillion, not to mention private. And President Biden, as we speak, is trying to go around the United States Supreme Court to spend more money on education by forgiving the private debt of students who have borrowed money. Is that really in the collective good? I mean, that money has to come from somewhere. But the broader sociological view that is a little different from the emphasis in economics is that the relative nature of educational expansion means that the sum is more, I mean, the society is more than just the sum of the total. I mean, the more and more people go to college, the more and more it becomes a rat race, as they say in game theory. It's strictly a relative competition. And so if you streamline those government expenditures, you'll be able to pay more for welfare state expenditures, which, pension and transfer payments that are more directly relevant to promoting equality in result, rather than assuming you're going to get there by spending more money on universities. I mean, I wish they worked, because that's our industry. We like to believe that it's making society more equal, but we don't see that so much in the aggregate. We're just moving around who gets into sort of the elite class. So there's a lot of slides. I'm happy to take any questions, but again, if you want to review any of this material, just Google my name and the kinds of education. I think you can download them without being a member of that website. And thank you very much.